Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 193, and this time I'm going to talk about Joan Baez's full solo debut on Vanguard Records from 1960, Joan Baez. What I have here is the 1964 reissue on Vanguard with, of course, its classic cover, the heavily processed photo by Rick Stafford of Joan at age 19. In terms of what to expect in this record, well, it's all folk music, of course. It's all traditional folk, very simple arrangements. Pretty much each song has just a sequence of verses. Occasionally you get a bridge or a chorus, but that's a real rarity. On this record, we're introduced to Joan's voice and its three main characteristics, at least at this stage in her career. This lovely, lilting treatment of the verses. By contrast, her tendency to absolutely belt it out when she gets to a place where she feels emphasis is required, and of course, that distinctive, tight vibrato of hers. All of this is magnificently captured by the engineering and recording process, sometimes a little overwhelmingly so. And in fact, this record has long been prized by audiophiles for the quality of its sound. There was in particular a great reissue of this done by Kraft Records, I think in 2018, which I recommend picking up. This record, and really Joan's whole career at this stage, after she'd made this big splash at Newport in 1959, helped to take folk music back towards what seemed to be authenticity and away from the commerciality, and here I feel like I'm sounding like one of the people in A Mighty Wind, into which some critics felt it had been drifting. Joan Baez was born in Staten Island in January 1941 to a family with a rich religious history. Her mother was from Edinburgh and was the daughter of an Anglican clergyman. Her father was also the child of a clergyman, in this case a Methodist minister to a Spanish-speaking congregation in Brooklyn. Her dad had considered following his own dad into the church, but elected against that eventually in favor of a career in physics, and he becomes a co-inventor of the X-ray microscope. The family all became Quakers when Joan was quite young, and this influenced a lot of her future musical direction and, of course, her activism. She has two sisters as well, both of whom became both musicians and activists. As I mentioned, she was born in New York, but Joan becomes a bit of a UNESCO brat because her dad was working for the UN organization at the time. And in the 1940s and early 1950s, the family travels all over the place, living in North America, Europe, and the Middle East. Eventually, in the early 50s, they settle in the Bay Area near San Francisco, and Joan ends up graduating from Palo Alto High School in 1958. As a kid, she picked up the ukulele and had learned how to play R&B songs. In 1954, she goes to see a Pete Seeger concert at the age of, 13, and this really changes her life. And within 2 years, at age 15, she's performing locally in Palo Alto on her ukulele playing folk tunes. She doesn't actually buy a guitar for another year. The whole folk thing gets a bit of a boost for her in 1958 when, after she graduates from high school, her dad takes a job at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where there was a big folk scene. So the family moves and she begins to gig in and around Cambridge. And her first ever paying gig occurs in 1958 in front of apparently 8 people, most of whom were family members, and she gets paid $10. Anyway, it's upward from there. In May 1959, she makes a basement recording with a couple other folk singers in the local scene, Ted Alevizos and Bill Wood. This is released in 1960 on the tiny local folk label Veritas, named after the Harvard motto, called Folk Singers Round Harvard Square. Also in 1959 in Cambridge, she meets the folk singer Bob Gibson, who invites her to come and sing with him at the forthcoming Newport Folk Festival that summer. Her first major appearance is at Newport in 1959, and she sings 2 duets with Gibson, and it's a sensation. And it leads to a huge competition between Vanguard Records and Columbia Records for her signature. She also got a bit of an instant image out of that performance because she'd sung in her bare feet and became known as the Barefoot Madonna. After some consideration, Joan, who, as you might imagine, was quite idealistic at age 19, felt that she'd have more artistic freedom with a smaller label like Vanguard rather than the big boys Columbia, so she signs with Vanguard, and she records her debut for them in the summer of 1960. This record is made in New York City over 4 days in July 1960. It principally features Joan singing and accompanying herself on acoustic guitar, Fred Hellerman of the Weavers, who had been blacklisted as part of the McCarthy hearings and all of the fallout from that, provides some accompaniment on guitar on, I think, 6 tracks. It was recorded in the ballroom of the Manhattan Towers Hotel. It was an unglamorous hotel up on Broadway on the Upper West Side around 79th. Recording sessions had to be planned around Wednesday nights because Wednesday nights the ballroom hosted bingo. Nevertheless, the reason for the ballroom being chosen was because of its acoustics. Vanguard Records had recorded a number of classical recordings there, and the engineer, who was this German guy called Marco Bort, had recorded the Weavers there frequently. The producer of this record is Maynard Solomon, who was the co-owner of Vanguard Records, also the co-founder. He'd founded the label with his older brother Seymour when he was only 20 years of age. Maynard Solomon is a key figure in the U.S. folk music revival. He was a Marxist, and he worked actively to sign and resuscitate the careers of people who had been blacklisted by the McCarthy hearings in the early 1950s. The Weavers, as I mentioned, after some commission testimony, have been blacklisted. They've been dropped by Decca Records. Decca Records had also taken the step of removing all of their records from their back catalog. Maynard recorded their comeback concert at Carnegie Hall in 1955 and released it as a live recording, which did extremely well in 1957. He also signed Paul Robeson, who'd been blacklisted as well. Vanguard had a bit of a rep for their classical recordings, but they were really at the forefront of the folk scene, and in particular, they had the exclusive rights to issue live recordings of the performances at the Newport Folk Festival, which is kind of the gig on the East Coast. All in all, an interesting guy, and he was also a musicologist, and he went on to do biographies of Mozart, Schubert, and Beethoven. Anyway, getting back to the recording sessions, this is what Joan had to say. I stood on the dirtiest rug in New York City in my bare feet, dwarfed by the huge, musty room, and sang into 3 microphones. Freddie Hellerman of the Weavers used a 4th microphone after I decided, under great pressure, that a 2nd instrument, tastefully played, was not commercial, but rather enhanced the music. The track list is basically her coffeehouse set list at the time. She had about 19 songs she would regularly play. 13 of them are on here. As I mentioned, all the songs are traditional folk songs. There are no original compositions. 2 of these are so-called child ballads. The child ballads, as they became known, are an anthology of a little more than 300 traditional ballads, English ballads and Scottish ballads, compiled by this guy called Francis James Child in the Victorian era. This is all part of the intense Victorian interest in rediscovering or reinventing or sometimes just inventing so-called traditional British practices. Anyway, Child anthologizes all these ballads. The lyrics and the music are published and republished, and particularly republished during the folk music revival in the US in the 1950s. As I mentioned, 2 of those are on here, including Mary Hamilton, which is an absolutely beautiful song and probably the highlight of the record. The record's also notable for a song which Joan sings entirely in Spanish, El Preso Numero 9, which she re-records and re-releases in 1974. A lot of songs on here. I'm not going to mention them all, but there's quite a few highlights. And the first of those is the very first song on the record, Silver Dagger. Right away, jumping out of the speakers is that amazing tight vibrato of Joan's, really quite striking. Fare Thee Well is an English song which probably dates from the 17th century. Here we have Joan in full, almost operatic mode, just blowing open the doors of the coffee house. Sometimes wonder what she might be told today by people like the coaches on The Voice, maybe to sort of tone it down or rethink the dynamics. Anyway, this is full on. House of the Rising Sun is on here. This, of course, predates the Animals version, and it's very different from the Animals version. It's got a different melody, kind of a different chord progression. Overall, side one is pretty good. I have to say, though, that at times the dynamics, and particularly Joan's voice when she chooses to really punch it and belt, is kind of overwhelming. Side 2, however, is terrific, pretty much start to finish. John Riley is a song about a guy who's been gone for 7 years, and he comes back, his lover doesn't recognize him, and he tests her fidelity to him and her love for him before he reveals his identity to her, which kind of stretches credulity because he's only been gone 7 years and maybe he's got a beard or whatever. Anyway, the song is beautiful, the delivery is imaginative and tasteful, and it's dynamic in a good way. Rake and Rambling Boy is a bluegrass, or actually probably a flat-out country tune. This is a wonderful performance. It's got witty lyrics and a theme that a lot of people can relate to. Mary Hamilton, which as I mentioned is one of the 2 child ballads, is the 16th century song from Scotland, reinterpreted over many, many years, which is about, purportedly, supposedly it's an apocryphal story about a lady in waiting to the Queen of Scotland who becomes pregnant by the king. She kills the child by putting it out adrift to sea, and this crime is discovered, and she's tried and is awaiting execution, and the song is sung from her perspective as she's awaiting her execution. As I mentioned, this is maybe the highlight of the album. This is really Joan, well, certainly at her early best. There is so much in the lyrics for her to work with. The delivery is excellent. The melody is also super. So just a great song. The last track on the album is a Spanish number I mentioned, El Preso Numero 9, which is about a guy who has killed his wife and her lover, who was his friend. Anyway, he has this discussion with a priest. The priest is trying to get him to repent. He's telling the priest, I'm not repenting. In fact, if I'm born again after I'm executed, I'm going to come back and kill them again. This performance by Joan drifts back a little bit to the issues with dynamics and belting that occur in side 1, but overall it's a very strong performance. As I've mentioned, while the performance is excellent, this isn't an easy listen for the first few tracks at times, because if you listen to it at full volume, you're getting almost distortion in your own ears, such is the intensity of her voice. Trouble is, if you turn it down, then you're kind of missing the subtler bits, so a little bit of an issue with the dynamic range. But side 2, as I mentioned, is pretty much fantastic start to finish. It's probably the best place to start in her catalog, and it captures a purity of focus and a musical intensity that very few artists could match. For me, it's 4 to 5 stars.